When Wendy O'Connor spoke to the Aberdeen Daily World on April 8, 1994, just hours after learning her son Kurt Cobain was dead, she uttered 7 words that would echo through rock history forever. Now he's gone and joined that stupid club. But what she said next revealed something far more haunting. I told him not to join that stupid club. These weren't the words of a grieving mother in shock. They were the words of someone who had been watching a slow-motion tragedy unfold for months, maybe years, and had been powerless to stop it. The full story of what Wendy O'Connor knew about her son's fate and why she specifically feared he would die at 27 like Hendrix, Joplin, and Morrison before him has remained largely untold. Through interviews with family friends, previously overlooked footage, and Wendy's own scattered comments over the years, we can now piece together the heartbreaking story of a mother who saw her son heading toward disaster with the terrible clarity that only a parent can possess. To understand Wendy's premonition, we need to go back to September 11, 1992, 19 months before Kurt's death. MTV had come to Seattle to film Nirvana's homecoming show at the Coliseum. It was supposed to be a triumphant moment. The local boys who had conquered the world were returning home. In the crowd that night was Wendy O'Connor, surrounded by Kurt's aunts, uncles, and family members who had known him since he was a hyperactive kid in Aberdeen. When MTV's cameras found Wendy in the crowd, she was beaming with pride. Her son, the sensitive boy who used to draw disturbing but beautiful pictures, who used to sing Beatles songs in his bedroom, was now the biggest rock star in the world. But when the interviewer asked her about Kurt's meteoric rise to fame, something shifted in her expression. The smile remained, but her eyes betrayed a deeper concern. "I'm happy for him," Wendy told the MTV interviewer, choosing her words carefully. "But I'm also terrified. Kurt has always been different. He feels everything so deeply. When he was happy as a child, he was the happiest kid you'd ever seen. But when he was sad," she paused, seeming to reconsider her words. "When he was sad, it was like watching someone drown on dry land." The interviewer, perhaps not prepared for such a heavy response at what was meant to be a celebration, pressed on cheerfully. "But he must be so happy now with all this success." Wendy's response would prove prophetic. Success doesn't cure pain. Sometimes it amplifies it. And Kurt, he knows about the history. Jimmy, Janice, Jim Morrison, they were all about his age now. 27 seems to be when the music industry swallows its most sensitive souls. The interviewer looked confused. This wasn't the typical proud parent interview they were expecting. But Wendy continued, as if compelled to put her fears into words. "I keep telling him, don't join that club. Don't become another casualty. But he just laughs and says, 'I'm not like them, Mom.' But he is. He's exactly like them. Too sensitive for this world. Too real for the fake parts of fame." This interview, filmed when Kurt was 25 years old, shows that Wendy was already connecting her son to the tragic pattern of the 27 Club, but her fear wasn't based on superstition or rock and roll mythology. It was based on intimate knowledge of her son's psychology, his history, and his dangerous relationship with pain. Kurt Donald Cobain had been a complicated child from the very beginning. Born on February 20, 1967, he was described by Wendy as hyperactive, intensely creative, and emotionally volatile. Before the age of 9, he was a relatively happy child, the center of attention in his family, beloved by his aunts and uncles. But his parents' divorce in 1976 shattered something fundamental in him. After the divorce, it was like watching a light go out. Wendy would later tell biographer Charles R. Cross. He went from being this bright, energetic kid to someone who was angry at the world. He felt betrayed, abandoned, and I don't think he ever really recovered from that feeling. The teenage years brought more struggles. Kurt was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. He suffered from chronic stomach pain that doctors couldn't properly diagnose or treat. He bounced between relatives' homes, never feeling like he belonged anywhere. By the time he was 15, he had already attempted suicide for the first time, a fact that Wendy would carry with her like a stone in her chest for the rest of her life. When your child tries to kill themselves as a teenager, Wendy later confided to her sister Mary, "You never stop watching for the signs. Every good day feels borrowed. Every birthday feels like a miracle. But you also know that the pain that drove them to that point doesn't just disappear, it hibernates, waiting." Music became Kurt's escape, his therapy, his reason for living. When he discovered punk rock, it was like finding a language for feelings he'd never been able to express. The raw emotion, the anger, the vulnerability. It all made sense to him in a way that nothing else in his life did. Wendy watched as music transformed her son from a depressed teenager into someone with purpose, even if that purpose was fueled by rage and pain. But she also noticed something else. Kurt's encyclopedic knowledge of rock history, particularly its tragedies. He would talk for hours about musicians who had died young, especially those who died at 22. Hendrix, Joplin, Morrison. He studied their music, their lives, their deaths. It wasn't morbid fascination. It was something more like recognition. He would say things like, "They got out at the right time," remembered his Aunt Mary Earle. Not in a suicidal way, but like he understood why someone would want to leave at their peak rather than fade away. It scared the hell out of Wendy. When Nirvana exploded onto the mainstream with Nevermind in 1991, Kurt was 24 years old. In less than 6 months, he went from sleeping on friends' couches, being one of the most famous people in America. The album knocked Michael Jackson's Dangerous off the top of the charts. Smells Like Teen Spirit was everywhere. Kurt's face was on every magazine cover, and Wendy watched it all with a mixture of pride and terror. "She called me crying one day," remembered Linda Carroll, Courtney Love's mother and Wendy's friend. She said, "They're calling him the voice of a generation." Do you know what that kind of pressure does to someone like Kurt? He can barely handle being the voice of himself. The fame that Kurt had both craved and feared was everything Wendy had worried it would be. She watched as her son struggled with the contradiction of being a punk rock star, an anti-establishment figure who was now the establishment. The chronic stomach pain that had plagued him for years became worse under stress. He began self-medicating with heroin, justifying it as the only thing that helped his pain. "The heroin scared me," Wendy would later admit, but not as much as the look in his eyes. It was the same look he had after the divorce. Like he was fundamentally disappointed in the world and couldn't figure out how to live in it. As 1993 progressed, Kurt's behavior became increasingly erratic. He overdosed in New York and had to be revived. He was arrested for domestic dispute. His marriage to Courtney Love, which had seemed to give him stability, became increasingly tumultuous. And always, looming in the near future, was his 27th birthday. Kurt was very aware of the 27 Club, confirmed Danny Goldberg, Nirvana's manager. He would joke about it, but it was the kind of joking that made you uncomfortable. He was testing out the idea, seeing how it felt to say it out loud. In Michael Azarad's authorized biography, Come As You Are, published in October 1993, Kurt directly addressed the 27 Club. "I'm not worried about it," he said. "I don't want to join that stupid club." The fact that he used the exact same phrase, "stupid club," that his mother would later use, suggests this was something they had discussed, perhaps repeatedly. As February 20th, 1994 approached, Kurt's 27th birthday, those close to him noticed a change. He seemed more withdrawn, more fatalistic. He would make comments about feeling old, feeling finished. The creative fire that had driven him seemed to be flickering. "Wendy called me in tears on his birthday," remembered Mary Frenberg, Wendy's sister. She said Kurt had called her, but he sounded so distant, so removed. He kept talking about how 27 was the age, and how he finally understood why people checked out at that point. She was terrified. According to those close to the family, the conversation between Kurt and Wendy on his 27th birthday was deeply troubling. While the exact details remain private, friends say Wendy begged Kurt to come home, to take a break from music, to get help for his depression and addiction. But Kurt was resistant, claiming there were too many obligations, too many people depending on him. She told me she actually said to him, "I don't want you to join that stupid club," Linda Carroll revealed, and Kurt supposedly replied, "It's not really a choice, Mom. It's just what happens to people like me." That's when Wendy knew she was losing him. The next few weeks were a nightmare for Wendy. Kurt's behavior became increasingly erratic. On March 3, 1994, Courtney Love called 911, reporting that Kurt had locked himself in a room with guns and was threatening suicide. He was briefly hospitalized. On March 18, Courtney staged an intervention, and Kurt reluctantly agreed to enter rehab at the Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles. But on April 1, 1994, Kurt scaled the wall of the rehab facility and disappeared. He had told staff he was stepping outside to smoke a cigarette and never returned. When Wendy heard he had left rehab, she later told friends she knew with terrible certainty what was coming. She said she felt it in her bones. Mary Frenberg recalled, she said, "He's 27, he left rehab, and he's made his decision. We've lost him." She was already grieving before he was even gone. For the next week, no one knew where Kurt was. Courtney hired a private investigator. Friends searched his usual haunts. But Kurt had vanished. Wendy spent those days in a state of suspended animation, unable to eat or sleep, waiting for the phone call she knew was coming. On April 8, 1994, that call came. Gary Smith, an electrician who had come to install a security system at Kurt's Seattle home, discovered his body in the greenhouse bayous, the garage. Kurt had been dead for approximately 3 days. He was 27 years old, having lived just 47 days past his 27th birthday. When reporters reached Wendy for comment, her first public words were, "Now he's gone and joined that stupid club. I told him not to join that stupid club." But what many people don't know is what she said next to family members, away from the reporters. 47 days. He fought it for 47 days past his birthday. That's longer than I expected. The tragedy of Wendy O'Connor's story is not that she possessed some supernatural knowledge of her son's fate. It's that she possessed something far more painful, a mother's intimate understanding of her child's pain, combined with the terrible knowledge of what happens when that kind of pain intersects with fame, addiction, and the weight of generational expectations at exactly the wrong age. "People want to make it mystical," Wendy said in a rare 2001 interview at a suicide prevention fundraiser. "They want to believe in curses and destiny. But the truth is simpler and sadder. Kurt was in tremendous pain. Physical, emotional, psychological. He was aware of the mythology of dying at 20. He was at an age where that mythology could seem like a solution rather than a tragedy. I could see all these factors converging, and I tried to warn him, to break the spell by naming it. But sometimes knowing something is coming doesn't mean you can stop it." Dr. Jan Burrow, a psychologist who has studied the 27 Club phenomenon, explained Wendy's prescience. When someone like Kurt, who is already struggling with suicidal ideation, becomes fixed on the idea that musicians die, it can become what we call a cognitive script, a narrative framework that makes suicide seem not just possible, but somehow predetermined or even meaningful. A mother who knows her child's thought patterns could absolutely see this developing. In the years following Kurt's death, Wendy rarely spoke publicly. When she did, she was careful to emphasize that Kurt's death wasn't about mystical curses or rock and roll mythology. It was about untreated pain, addiction, and the crushing pressure of fame on someone who was already fragile. "The 27 Club is a dangerous idea," Wendy said in 2005. "It romanticizes suicide, makes it seem like part of some grand tradition rather than what it really is, a permanent solution to temporary problems. I told Kurt not to join that club because I could see him being seduced by the idea of it. The tragedy is that he was brilliant enough to understand the mythology but too deep in his pain to see past it." In 2014, at Nirvana's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, Wendy stood on stage with the surviving members of the band. She didn't speak, but her presence was powerful. Dave Grohl later said that having her there was like having Kurt's blessing, that she represented both the joy of what the band had achieved and the sorrow of what was lost. Wendy knew, Rawls said in a later interview. She knew before any of us that we were losing Kurt. Not because she was psychic, but because she was his mother. She could see the patterns we were all too close to recognize. When she said she told him not to join that stupid club, she wasn't speaking metaphorically. She was literally trying to save his life by making him conscious of the narrative he was falling into. Friends of the family revealed that in Kurt's final months, Wendy had become almost obsessive about the number 27. She would call friends and family members, asking if they had heard from Kurt, always mentioning his age. "He's 27 now," she would say, as if the number itself was a ticking time bomb. "It wasn't superstition," insisted Mary Frenberg. "It was pattern recognition." Wendy had watched Kurt study these musicians, who died at 27. She had heard him talk about them with a kind of reverence. She knew he identified with them. Their sensitivity, their inability to cope with fame, their desire to escape pain. When he turned 27, she knew all these factors were converging. In one of her last public appearances in 2015, on what would have been Kurt's 48th birthday, Wendy reflected on her famous words about that stupid club. "I called it stupid because I wanted to diminish its power over him. I wanted him to see it as something silly, not romantic or meaningful. But for someone in as much pain as Kurt was, the idea of joining his heroes, of being forever young, forever at his peak, I could see how that would seem better than the alternative of continuing to suffer." She added something that still haunts those who heard it. "The saddest part is that 27 is so young. When you're that age, and in pain, you can't imagine that things might better at 30, at 40. You can't see past the immediate hurt. Kurt couldn't see that far, and I couldn't make him see it, no matter how hard I tried." Wendy O'Connor died on June 5, 2021 at the age of 74. In her final years, she had worked quietly with suicide prevention organizations, sharing her story with other parents who were watching their children struggle. She shut her claim to have supernatural knowledge, only the tragic clarity that comes from knowing someone deeply and watching them slowly slip away. Her warning to Kurt, "Don't join that stupid club," has become part of rock history. Often misunderstood as a mysterious premonition, but those who knew Wendy understood it differently. It was a mother's desperate attempt to break the spell of the 27 Club mythology, to make her son see that he had a choice, that the pattern wasn't destiny. The final tragedy is that Wendy was right about everything. She correctly identified the danger her son was in. She understood the psychological and cultural factors that made 27 such a dangerous age for him. She even tried to intervene by naming the pattern, hoping that awareness might break its power, but being right didn't give her the power to save him. Today, when musicians approach 27, the specter of the 27 Club still looms. Amy Winehouse, who died at 27 in 2011, had explicitly spoken open her fear of joining the club. Mac Miller died at 26, just shy of the cursed age. Each death adds to the mythology, making it more powerful, more seductive to those who are struggling. Wendy O'Connor's story stands as both a warning and a tragedy. The story of a mother who could see clearly what was coming, but was powerless to stop it. Her words, "I told him not to join that stupid club," echo not as prophecy, but as the desperate plea of someone who understood all too well the dangerous intersection of pain, fame, mythology, and youth. In the end, Kurt Cobain did join the 27 Club, becoming perhaps its most famous member after Hendrix. But Wendy's warning lives on, a reminder that behind every mythology is human pain, and behind every tragedy is often someone who saw it coming and tried, desperately and futilely, to prevent it. The curse of the 27 Club isn't supernatural. It's the all-too-human tendency to romanticize death when life becomes unbearable, especially when you're young enough to believe that the pain will never end.